So I'm glad you could join us, and I hope that I know that each of you is coming from a different perspective in this church planting journey, whether you are discerning a call to starting a new Episcopal community or are already up to your eyeballs in a new Episcopal community, or perhaps are one of the diocesan leaders that help support this work. So what I'm going to present, I just hope that you'll be able to take some nuggets with you that are relevant and helpful for wherever you are in that process. And throughout this conversation, maybe we can approach this from different perspectives as well. But this session that we're offering today is about discerning your point leader for a new project. Something that I have discovered being 2 months into this position on the presiding bishop's staff is that we use a whole bunch of different terms to talk about point leader versus church planter versus sometimes we talk about a mission developer. Those are all terms for what is basically the same thing, which is I describe as the person who casts and leads the vision for a new church start, who gathers the community, and is ultimately the person where it's kind of like the buck stops here, who does the accounting and communicating with diocesan leaders, and is really the point person in charge of a new community. That's going to take different, somewhat different shapes depending on what kind of ministry it is, but a lot of the responsibility and a lot of the characteristics that are helpful in that person are similar. So I'm going to pull up, if I can, I have never shared my screen on this new computer, but I'm going to try. There you go. You all able to see this assessment? It's called the Assessor's Grid, Arriving at a Disposition. Good. This is something that our assessment teams use whenever we have what's called a Discerning Missional Leadership Retreat. These, sometimes we abbreviate it DML, but you may have seen these in my monthly updates or online. A Discerning Missional Leadership Retreat, I sometimes describe as being a little bit like the Commission on Ministry. If you have that in your diocese or have ever experienced it, it involves a team of about 6 assessors, all of whom have some experience with missional leadership and of being the point person in a new church plant or some other kind of new Episcopal community. And we come together with 9 or 10 participants who are looking to really discern whether this work is a good fit for them, or if they're already knee-deep into it, how they might look more deeply at the gifts that they bring to this work, and also to use some of that knowledge to determine what other kinds of gifts and competencies would be good at helping them bolster their team. And to really help people with that discernment work, we've come up with a list of about 13, I think it's 12 or 13 competencies. Sometimes they're competencies, some of them are sort of personality quirks that are helpful with this work. I think it's important to say that if you look across the Episcopal Church at the people who are being highly successful in roles like cardinal rectors, sometimes bishops, diocesan staff members, our bishops and cardinal rectors don't always have these competencies and these personality quirks. This really is very specific work and specific characteristics that that fit a certain kind of ministry in the church. So and don't guarantee success or failure in any other kind of ministry. So I hope we can kind of keep that in mind as we go through this. But any thoughts or questions up to this point? Good. As we go through this list, particularly if you're a diocesan leader who really feels a call to helping people with gifts assessment, or if you're really looking at the possibility of a church plant or new missional community, maybe just keep in mind the question of whether you know someone who exhibits some of these qualities. Sometimes it can be someone who's ordained, and as in a growing number of our missional communities, it might be a layperson. So just kind of keep that with you. And Janet and Jason and David, I'm going to go through these in chunks, but I invite you, if in your experience, you have something to add from the perspective of a coach or a diocesan leader, just jump in with me here. So the first set of these competencies that are really helpful in a church planter have to do with the person themselves. So you'll just see that Roman numeral up there. And the first two for me go together: faithfulness, which is probably good for all Episcopal leaders to have, right? But is able to demonstrate, but also talk about a compelling relationship with God that they have. Sorry, I'm gonna cough there. And that goes along with a strong motivational fit for this kind of work. Demonstrates a vision and intrinsic motivation for church planting or missional leadership. I serve on the Commission on Ministry here in Alabama, and I think we're getting better at this, but sometimes it does feel like when we lift someone up for ordination or for leadership, we are expecting them to say how much they love the Episcopal Church, how much they love the tradition and liturgy. And it's actually a red flag for me if I were to ask a potential mission developer or church planter what they love best about the Episcopal Church, and if the answer was something like the 1982 hymnal and the organ, or the preaching, because preaching itself is going to look very different in a church plant as you're working with a core team. So you want to watch for if the person you're really looking at, if they want to leave the church and office walls and go out into the unknown and be around a whole lot of people who might not already be part of a worshiping community. That's the kind of motivation that we're looking at. Also, if they really have the motivation, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, for building something from scratch rather than coming in and managing and making something that already exists better. So that's a piece of it as well.
Can I just jump in there, Katie?
Yeah, I hope you will, Janet.
There's a lot of tension and discussion and energy around this question of worship and how we worship as missional communities. And context is very important. I want to just highlight what Katie said about motivation. And it's really, she said a flag for her, she has some flags around worship. And I think not so much the kind of worship, because traditional 1982 hymnal, prayer book, liturgy in some new contexts is exactly what the doctor ordered. But in other contexts, other worship times, worship styles, and whatnot are part of the deal. The motivation is the underlying, do folks have the bandwidth to realize that they may need to adjust their idea about what worship is going to look like? And do they have the bandwidth to say, hey, look, this is the choice. This is the choice that we're making together, and we're going to stick with it, even if we get some feedback as we develop this, that there are some people who won't come because that's what we're doing. We're committed to going this direction. So somebody who really has the motivational fit to have some clear boundaries and direction, as well as to have some energy and discernment around what might be new. I hope that makes sense. But yeah, yeah.
That's great, Janet. And that's making me think of a church plant that we're walking alongside right now. That's an Anglo-Catholic church plant. And they have all those very traditional sensibilities. But right now, since they're just starting out, they're meeting in a school and having to convert lunch tables into pews on Sunday. And actually, they couldn't use the school on Christmas Eve, so their service was outside. So that's kind of that adaptability, but within tradition, I think that you're getting at.
Katie, can I jump in here a little bit? It's so good to start this off by focusing on the person. I think, and you're doing these assessment retreats yourself, but I think it's really tricky to find the person who has enough internal motivation, enough self-starting energy, and enough fire in the gut to do this. You want the disc profile or the Enneagram, some of the instruments that measure these energy flows in a person's psyche. If the person doesn't have a high flow of energy and a lot of self-start and a real passion in their gut for the gospel, they're not going to make it. Whether it's what we call a mission enterprise zone, or what you did with the coffee house ministry or a traditional worshiping community, the mission developer is basically out there on their own, facing a context they have to explore and get to know. They have to create interactions in that context. They have to know what a launch team person looks like. Having coached some people who assessed out fairly well, but who didn't work out as mission developers, this is tricky. And someone can look good and they can talk well and be missing that intangible thing that this number one thing enumerates. So yeah. I don't know what to say about it, except that sometimes in your gut, as a diocesan leader or an assessor, you will know something's missing. And if you feel that in your gut, listen to it.
Good.
That's all I know to say.
And some pieces of that you just brought up are going to come up in here as well. Although I agree with that gut feeling also. The next two items, number 3 and 4, also go together to some degree with me. Emotional resilience, the ability to manage conflict and personal failure, utilizing biblical principles and resolving conflict and overcoming failure, and able to press forward, be resilient in the face of stress. I think this is incredibly important. A number of the mission developers I talk to will talk about this as being an emotional roller coaster. Right, you might have a Sunday that's the launch that has been advertised to the whole diocese, that you have prepared and asked people to commit to attend, and that launch you might have 150 people present. I think that was the case when I started my ministry, the Abbey. There were too many people to even fit in the building. And then the next Sunday, the second and third Sundays roll around, and you're back down to 50. And then, kind of continues that way, have ups and downs. And for someone who, if they are like me and tend to evaluate your own strengths and success based on the number of people there on Sunday, that emotional roller coaster is going to be a wild ride. And so having some wisdom about that and emotional resilience is really helpful. There's some other probably examples that we can name. And then emotional maturity, the ability to understand and manage emotions, a realistic sense of self. This goes along with the being able to identify and deal with conflict fairly well. I don't know if conflict comes up more often in new church starts, but it can dig deep when it does. As a church planter myself, there were a few people who showed up very damaged from previous church experiences and who actually had damaged some other congregations. And when they came to be part of our community, they caused enough damage to our community that I eventually had to find a way to ask them to transfer their letter of membership somewhere else. And that was a moment of conflict that probably parts of it I handled well and parts of it I didn't. But you're looking for someone with the ability to manage those kinds of issues and those kinds of ups and downs. And then number 5, social base, kind of what we use to describe the reality that when you are church planting or developing a new community, it can feel like everyone around you gets sucked into that. So I've heard my friend Tim Bayer, when he was presenting last month, talk about there being weeks when 4 or 5 nights out of the week, he and his wife and his 2 children hosted people in their home. As they had one-on-one conversations and brought together their core team. It was their house that became the stomping ground. Your spouse, significant other, brother, sister, sometimes parents are going to get sucked into the emotional roller coaster. And it's important to be able to have somebody in this position who's got a strong base of healthy relationships. And often I would say preferably some friendships that will withstand outside of this particular project or this new community. Will help be part of a collegial and friendship network that'll uplift you as you undertake this work. Can I stop for just a second and see if there's anyone that's got thoughts or questions?
Yeah, on that last one, you know, I'm not married. I live alone, except for Beasley, the greyhound. And I do have to really work at that, but honestly, you know, my day is so full because I'm also bivocational. You know, I have students in and out of my office all day long. I'm interacting with colleagues and friends and things like that. But you're right, there needs to be, you know, a close person that's either a friend or a family member that you can talk things out with, you know, and get some perspective. I have an uncle that's a long time Episcopalian, and I'm relatively new at this, and you know, to talk to him and be able to just let my emotions flow in talking to him has been tremendously, you know, it's been a tremendous blessing, because I don't know if I could have done this, you know, without that kind of support.
This is often described as very lonely. Usually church planters don't have certainly don't have an associate, often don't have a deacon, and are often planting in they're planting in a place where there's not already an Episcopal presence. So it can be very isolating, and having people who can uplift them in that work is really helpful, and is also an area where diocesan leaders can try to be helpful and supportive, just knowing how lonely this work can be. The second section, David, I feel like you were getting at some of these, are missional competencies. The first is entrepreneurial experience. In my the 4 discerning missional leadership retreats I've been able to be on, my observation is that this entrepreneurial experience manifests itself at a pretty young age. So when you ask a potential mission developer, have you ever started anything? A lot of them will go back to, oh yeah, when I was 13, I started a pet sitting business. Or yeah, when I was in college, I don't know, I was always the not the SGA president, right, but the person starting the parties, or help gathering people to do a school project, or someone on the last call brought up a Compline service that they had started at their seminary. So even if it's not, even if they've never started a church before, there are ways that you can, that people will have experienced that kind of, just that kind of characteristic in themselves that naturally come up. As part of that, able to overcome obstacles and challenges. But really also what we're getting at here is the ability not just to have a vision and not just to talk about a vision, but to make that vision turn into reality. Maybe this is kind of my cynical side. Sometimes that's rare in the church, talking, and a little bit less. Dive in, David.
Make a quick comment about that. When we were at Bishop Lee's behest organizing the vocational diaconate in the Diocese of Virginia, and we were discerning people for the vocational diaconate, one of our protocols was that we wanted to see them already engaged in some form of servant diaconal ministry at the present moment. And it goes to what you're talking about with your entrepreneurial spirit. If you're assessing someone who's waiting to start something and has never started something, then that person is probably not going to work out. You're looking for people who just routinely, habitually do this kind of thing. It's just in their nature.
Yeah, I like that word, habitually do this thing. We will talk to some potential mission developers at these retreats where we're like, you know, they're right now, it sounds like they're in a context that's not supportive, or that is maybe not going to be a long-term kind of placement or thing, but it almost doesn't matter, because no matter where they go, they're going to be starting something. Good. Missional practices is the second under these competencies. Demonstrates the ability to develop authentic relationships with unchurched people and engage in a local community. I think, unfortunately, this is also more rare than we would like it to be in our Episcopal context. I live in Alabama, so there's not a whole lot of unbaptized or kind of technically unchurched people, the way that Ann Steigerwald, our retreat facilitator, talks about them in Washington State. But there are still plenty of people who are somehow disengaged from church, and that if I locked myself up in a church office, I would never run across or talk to. So we're looking for people who friendships outside of the church, and are able to really talk to people in a local community, shop owners, business owners, neighborhood associations, that kind of thing, and easily make relationships. The third is risk-taking. I think even in a really supportive diocese or situation, church planting and mission development requires some kind of taking of risk. I think my compensation changed 5 times in 5 years. And so there was a level of, just a level of knowing that things for the first years of this church plant were not going to be stable. Not for me, not for my pension, and not for my family. And that we were in a new neighborhood. We were working with new people who didn't really know the Episcopal system, and a lot of what we do, or a lot of what we tried, was not going to work. And so, as a mission developer, you want to have people that are ready to some degree, take a calculated jump off the cliff to see if something is gonna float or not. And then number 4 is strong cross-cultural skills. I think when we talk about cross-cultural skills, a lot of times what first comes to mind is trying some kind of language specific or culture or ethnic specific church plant, and that can be true. We've got an Arab American congregation going now, a number of Latinx congregations, Asian American groups that are getting started. But I think this can also apply to a church planter from the big city that's trying to plant something in a rural area or in a different part of the country. So an appreciation for those kind of cultural differences and the ability to see their own cultural bias and to come at those from a place of humility. Before I continue on, any thoughts about those missional competencies? Okay, good. And then the third category, also something that came up a little bit earlier, are the skills at leading and working with other people. Building a successful team. And sometimes from my observation, church planters who have a lot of these other competencies, who don't mind working alone, can struggle when it comes to building a successful team and surrounding themselves with people that have got gifts other than what they have, and really working together both to turn the vision into reality, but also to kind of like assume responsibility of this project and where it's going. But it's helpful to know that someone is either has already got these or is willing to develop them further through some coaching. We describe this as using appropriate methods and a flexible style in order to build a cohesive team, gain trust of others, and facilitate the completion of those kind of team goals. This is the kind of work that just can't sit on one person's shoulders. It's going to require a strong core team, and the church planter or mission developer is the person who gathers and facilitates this work for them and with them. Another piece is plain old human gathering. Someone that has a gift for invitation and inviting people not just to come and see or come and worship on a Sunday, but is able to take the risk of inviting them to commit as well. Commit to attending, commit to pledging, commit to helping make a vision reality, or to be able to invite them to commit to taking an unfinished product and building something together. That's a big question. It's one that we all have to grow into asking, I think. Number 3 on here, something we talk about a lot, is grit. Mike Mickey, my predecessor in this position, had a great line, which is that church plants are made in the crock pot, not the microwave. It takes a long time, takes a lot of effort. Sometimes you take the top off and you realize you forgot to plug it in, or it's not hot yet. It takes hours. And the crock pot and a church plant is going to take years. So this is not a 6 months to a year and it's done. Our church planters need to have the grit to withstand a lot of this pressure and roller coaster for the long term. And just to give I know Jason will talk a little bit more about this next month when we talk about success and measurables. But it's starting to look like 7 years, or sometimes a minimum of 7 years is what it takes to get even a traditional church plant off the ground and financially self-sustaining. So that gives an idea of the length of time. And actually, I think we talked a little bit in our last meeting about how it's around year 4 that you can tell whether a community is actually going to coalesce. That's a long time. It's a long time to stick with this. And then I mentioned some about a few minutes ago, is strong church planters are leadership developers. We do see quite a bit of church planters who have been able to have the grit and who have stuck it out for a number of years. And then as soon as they leave, the community collapses or dissipates because they haven't, the thing that they haven't done is build leadership among other team members and the folks who are going to stay. And so there's an empowering and equipping of others in the pursuit of the team's purpose and vision. And I like this last line a lot. Doesn't micromanage or hold tightly to control. There's a lot that, there's a lot in these church plants that doesn't go as expected. And something that I know I had to learn as I was church planting was to have a little more flexibility with people and not hold too tightly to the outcomes that I was expecting and hoping for. Good. All right, so that is the assessment grid. I'm going to stop my screen share. I put the link to the grid in that Google Doc. Oh, somebody had already asked me about that. So I put the link in the Google Doc so that you will have it and you can go back and look at that grid and even print it off if you would like to, as you're thinking about who you know who might have some of these characteristics. But I wonder if there's some pieces of this that you'd like to discuss or offer up some of your own observations about.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Hi, everyone. It's that last part, the third section, and it might be in there, but the word that comes to me and experience in that whole third section of team building and leadership and everything is inspire. I think it's not in my experience, it hasn't been just finding a team, building a team, equipping a team, and empowering the team, but also inspiring, which can be really hard too.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. It's the being able to take your intrinsic vision and deliver it and speak to it in such a way that others are able to also take on that vision and make it their own. Yeah, I think and partly it also relates, that piece to some degree relates to that faithfulness piece at the very beginning and being able to articulate who Jesus is and what this Holy Spirit is speaking into this project.
I have a question.
Yeah, you unmuted me.
So I am assuming that this grid is more likely to work when you're discerning in the beginning. And, if you're talking about 7 years, for example, I think the role of the leader might significantly change over the course of that 7 years. And I'm wondering if there are other types of grid or something that we can add or take out as the time moves on, and then your church planting kind of gets onto some kind of rhythm that it's not necessarily the charismatic leader who starts things, but who actually needs to maintain, yet holding that fire. And that's kind of where we are right now. So it's just an open question.
Oh my gosh, and it's such a good one because a number of our church planters who really have the equipment and the desire to take a vision and run also want to run in the other direction when it starts to be time to write bylaws and manage this thing that they've created. Jason, you've got some kind of long-term experience with this. Do you have any thoughts on Yane's observation?
No, I think you're right, Yane, that the skill set does change as time goes on. That's for certain. I think it's also telling about the motivations for a leader and how they they handle those different evolutions, if they're really committed to creating a culture and shaping something that outlasts their own tenure, they'll tend to work as best as they can to grow with the community and to adapt themselves to the task at hand. And part of that is because they're driven more by the vision than their own particular ego. For some folks, that it's just clear to them and to the people that they're building community with that they have a certain skill set and they're good at getting things going, and then they need to get out of the way. And so there probably are fewer serial starters in the church, the people that kind of just start and start and start. And I think there comes as many challenges as gifts that come with that particular personality trait. But in my experience, the leaders that really are committed to the right things tend to do their best to try to evolve with the community as is required by them, at least the healthy ones.
Katie, it occurs to me that in a humorous sort of way, we could use a general ordination exam for mission developers as a diagnostic tool, because someone who has that entrepreneurial spirit that we're talking about is obviously going to have lacks in their skill sets that Jason is referring to. And you might have someone that you know can do the start, but do they have the self-awareness to understand their deficits and to recruit leadership that can complement them on a team? If the mission developer is a design developer on the front end of the assembly line, they're no good at putting parking lights on the vehicle when it gets to the other end of the line. So they have to have enough self-awareness to recruit the team around them that complements them and supplements what they don't have, if they're going to be able to stay with the work and lead it to a more mature place.
Yeah, and David, you brought up earlier the DISC profile. A tool that we use in these discernment retreats is the Clifton Strengths Finder. And this is one that's, I think, used by a number of different businesses and coaches. Just to give you the overview, there's 34 themes that they say are demonstrated over the human population. And you take this $19.99 quiz, they'll give you your top 5. And they're actually incredibly, they're helpful in helping you understand the strengths from which you naturally lead. So just to give you an example, my number 1 is achievement, and my number 2 is learning. Now there's ceilings, like I can use those strengths really well, and then there's basements, they can also drag me down. But once you start to look at the top 5, and that's something that a church planter can do with their core team, not so much to see how make sure that they have all the bases covered, although that's a piece of it, but also to watch how those interactions happen among people who have different strengths and skills for leadership. Yeah.
Right.
And something I
routinely use that
in the retreats. Right. Something we talk about in the retreats is as an awareness of your own strengths, and then who are you going to have to find to supplement you.
Yeah, that's at the beginning end of this. That is one of the most helpful pieces of getting clarity on the emotional intelligence and self-awareness of the people that you are considering as church planting leaders. Is if they can talk about their gaps, their weaknesses, and with honesty and without hubris, and think with you about how to address those and the remainder of a leadership team, etc. That's someone that's going to be able to grow and in a healthy way with the team that they develop. If someone comes out the gate very defensive about where their weaknesses are and is unable to provide any experience as to addressing that, that's probably a good sign that this may not be the right kind of person, because we're not building platforms for leaders. We're building communities, ecclesia, the gathering of the called out. So that's an important piece. And as I hope that you all took away from what Katie was sharing, the importance of a person's capacity to reflect on previous experience, because that is going to be one of the best indicators of their future performance, whether that be in a religious context or secular. If they can draw from their experience, that demonstrates that they're a learner, that they can go through something and say, whether it worked or not, I'm learning from this, and here's how I will do things better or different the next time around. And so having the kinds of conversations that these prompts help you have is incredibly helpful in giving you a glimpse into whether or not this is a leader that can grow, that can approach leadership with humility, and is self-aware about where their strengths lie and where the strengths of others need to come into play.
And I will echo one of the comments made earlier. I think Reverend Kim, many of us enter these systems later. That is, we are called to what was and is a plant, and I think that there's not even a recognition, and so some of the initial work is, boy, I'm entering a system that really is a plant, despite not being there at its birth. And I think the recognition that all of these attributes and competencies matter, no matter where you are. If you are sort of fifth in a row of clergy, and you also recognize the shortcomings of those who went before, and that sort of places your system in a particular place. And so I think people have a perception that planters are only at the beginning, but I think in some ways, some of us enter systems that are plants later, and kind of recognize that and lift them up as, guess what you're doing? You're continuing a plant.
Yes. And one of the things we're beginning to talk about on the task force for church planting is potentially having reworking this a little bit for people who are actually doing redevelopment work. So who are clergy and lay leaders who walk into a church, whether they know it or not, that needs a little work and needs and a lot of that work is going to lean on some of these more missional competencies. Yeah. Any other thoughts? I've also,
I have a different question.
Yeah.
I don't know if that's too much of like a tangent. So I'm in sort of an unusual, I'm a lay leader, rural context, not received in my church, doing church planting, complicated. So we're already maybe like doing something that's like slightly unusual, but I'm curious because I feel like everything I've been reading and learning at Genesis is about like you have your point person, and maybe that person changes over time, but you have this one point person surrounded by a core team. And I'm just curious, like we are Trinitarians, like, is there any like context in which you might choose to have like 2 or 3 people working like jointly on this, which I realize sounds kind of weird because like we're an institution where you have, you have your rector and your associate and you have your like very clear hierarchy. So I don't know if this is like too unconventional, but like we're exploring a church plant that would be a joint initiative of 3 different churches that are in 3 totally different towns. So it kind of seems like we would just want 3 core leaders, myself being one of 3. I don't know. What are your thoughts on this?
I think that's a great idea. One of the things that we know about church planting is it doesn't work if there's just a solo leader. That said, it requires somebody to be a prime instigator. There needs to be that one person in the mix, and it usually just happens to be that it's one that kind of push and prods people to move forward towards whatever the vision is, and that might be you. But going at this with a team effort is a really wise thing to do, because there's going to be There's going to be more people with a variety of strengths in that mix that are going to be able to lead in different ways in that in this effort that you're taking on. So I don't think there's anything wrong with it. I think it's great. When we talk about it in a singular fashion, it's simply because when it comes down to it, usually there's only one clergy person, and that's the typical church plant in our tradition. Is it's led by a clergy person. I'm not a clergy person, so I feel you. I feel what you're bringing to the table here, and I think it's incredibly appropriate. And we simply know that it usually works out better the more that are involved and the more of a team idea. And it worked for Jesus. I mean, he sent out people by two, so I think it can work for us.
That's great, Jason. I like the differentiation between a point leader and a prime instigator. That prime instigator is somewhere, I've just seen in some team, I love the idea of a team, but that team does have to have the one person that's going to kind of like, if not drive it, push it forward. Make sure that the pieces, keep rolling. There's also some plants that I've started to see that, I'll come back to you in 1 second, David, where it'll start off as a team of 2 or 3, and then, I'm saying what you're going to say, maybe. And then 1 or 2 of those leaders moves away, or they get frustrated with each other. And I'm not sure I have any more to say about that. But it's a possibility that these projects, I think, have to keep in mind. Diocesan leaders should keep in mind as well.
I think some of that has to do with the fact that the way that we talk about church planting so often is focused on a primary leader. It forces most church plants to have to decide, well, someone's got to be on top. So who is the point person? And part is that it's mostly a culture that's driven by, it's male dominant mostly. And I think men are inclined to want to be solo leaders, and often women are a lot more adept at leading in community than a lot of male leaders are. And so some of it is that. But where it breaks down in teams, oftentimes where you have 3 to 5 people that are trying to lead something together, it's because the coaching and the training and the networks are so developed on a singular leading, getting the training, going to the conferences, having a coach, etc., that it becomes difficult for anybody to feel like they're actually on a level playing field. So those are things you just need to consider. It's Abby, right? So Abby, just be considerate of the fact that how will you make sure that if there is a multiplicity of leaders in shaping this, how can you ensure that everybody does have equal footing? Recognizing that somebody will be the kind of prime curator or instigator, or someone that's always pushing that community of leadership forward. And you may find more resources than thinking that way outside of Christian circles and in more like business leadership of how to develop a leadership team, as opposed to looking inside of Christian literature for that kind of inspiration.
Good, I love that question. Thanks, Abby.
I just had 2 quick comments about that. I have seen, and you all have seen, some mission development work that was done by married couples or partnered people that were to start up together as a pair that worked well. And my own journey with this in doing a mission, a new church start that was a parachute drop, it didn't take long before we had about 5 people who shared the commitment and who basically became a leadership team. And in Jason's words, I was the instigator, but it didn't take long before there were about 5 people clustered around in the first few months who really had that same kind of entrepreneurial spirit and daredevil mentality, and who were also able to recruit and share that with others.
Good. Any other thoughts or questions on this topic?
I have one. I have another one that just came to mind, which is, I think there are people like this description that are out there that we don't know are out there. And that they don't even know they don't even know what this work is, but they would be so well suited. They might just be sitting there in the pews. And how do we find them, or how have you, or how, you know, I'm in the New York Diocese, so I'm just beginning on the diocesan level with this work, with congregational development work. So that's what I'm curious about. I know how someone found me, and I know I was one of those people sitting in the pews, and I didn't even know what planting was.
Oh my gosh. Yeah. And so the deeper I got into this discernment work with church planters, the more I started to realize that on the commission on ministry that I have been on, and I think I have a great diocese with a great commission on ministry, but I think that it's possible we would have weeded a lot of these people out of that process, because we're not quite as interested in missional competencies as we are in how soothing someone would be in a hospital room. For I think decades we've been really discerning for skills in pastoral care, sometimes kind of executive leadership, although I'm not even sure about that. So there's I think an awareness that we need to start building in the church about needing people who have a different skill set, an entrepreneurial skill set. You know, how do you find them? I have an amazing friend here in Birmingham who I hope becomes an Episcopal deacon or clergy person someday, or remains a powerful lay leader. And I saw on his, and the reason I say this, I saw on his Facebook page last month that he ran the Mercedes Marathon with a client of his who's autistic. And he had gathered a group of like 35 people to run 26.2 miles with this family. And I was like, that's it. That's human gathering. So I would encourage you in your diocese, be watching for those kinds of people. Now they also have to want to do the work on a motivational level and on a spiritual level. You know, you're doing it for the church, not for a marathon. But there's ways to kind of watch for those gifts, or ask rectors of churches to watch for those kinds of gifts. Does anybody else have some experience with that?
Yeah, I would add that, you know, refer or think about how someone found you, and think about how you can do the same for others. One of the best things you can do is tell the stories of missional work and then invite people into it. And as you go into congregations, inviting people, share the characteristics. That's one of the ways that we lift up people to ordination, is we share with people the work and the characteristics of what is required to be a deacon or priest in the Episcopal tradition. And then people find their way into that calling. Well, why wouldn't we do the same for missional work? And I think that I would add to that, give people small scale, lean cost opportunities to demonstrate that this is something they're called to do. Those can be, starting a small group outside of the church during Lent or Advent, or any number of different things, but create opportunities for people that align with the characteristics of these kinds of entrepreneurial leaders to experiment with and try on these practices, and gathering people in this way, and you'll figure out who the leaders are. I think people are waiting to be given permission and be invited.
Good. Okay. Well, I'm so glad that this is a great conversation. I feel like I could go on and on about it. Our next, just FYI, our next Discerning Missional Leadership Retreat is May 18th through 21st in Austin, Texas. At the moment it's full, but we can keep a wait list if there's someone who you know who ought to be on it. And then there's another in Pittsburgh in August, and then another that I'm really hoping could be in New Orleans in October. we try to do these things in cities where there's a lot going on, and some interesting people about to interact with. But there's information about that on the website. And then as you're planning your April, let's see, I put this in our Google Doc as well. The next session that's geared specifically for diocesan leaders, as this one was, although practitioners are welcome on it as well, is April 14th, again at 2 o'clock Central. And I think that's going to be about defining metrics and success with Jason Evans. He's not unmuting, but do you want to say anything about that? Okay. Good.
Yeah, we're going to try to talk about scalable metrics, recognizing that we all work in different dioceses with different size dioceses, different size budgets and resources available to us, different income levels based upon regions. And so viability of a new community is different in different contexts. So I'm going to try to do my best to talk with you about how to measure things in a way that demonstrates the story you're trying to tell, what it is that you value, that develops clear expectations between the planter and the diocesan persons that they're reporting to. So hopefully it'll be helpful in whatever context you find yourself in. So that's about it.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to that one. Thanks, Jason. All right, friends. Thanks for giving us an hour and 15 minutes. I hope that this was helpful. That Google Doc link will still be good. And if you have any questions or thoughts or anything, please be in touch with me or Janet, who had to hop off, or Jason Evans. Go back to your sermon writing and your coronavirus fighting and all that good work God's given you.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you.
Thank you, Katie.